Occasionally in these Unsung Heroes episodes, we talk about a car which wasn't necessarily all that successful, and sometimes it wasn't necessarily all that groundbreaking either. It's just a car which might be obscure, super rare, which is essentially the same thing, of course, or a car that isn't talked about as much as you could arguably say it deserves to be, regardless of if it's successful or not. Because one of the things that I used to love the most as a kid was when I would find out that some manufacturer or some team had built, in particular, a race car, such as a Le Mans prototype, which I'd never heard of. When I first found out that companies like Chrysler had teamed up with the Dallara car, with the SP1 and various others, I thought that sounded awesome. The Cadillac LMP is my favourite modern LMP for that exact reason. It's so cool to me that Cadillac even has a car like that. Now, this is more so one of those occasions. Now, for those who are familiar with this channel, you'll probably know that I have quite a lot of love for Ascari. I believe that Ascari as a brand is an excellent one. They have a lot of undervalued cars, and of course we have featured Ascari before. In this same series, quite a few episodes back, we looked at the Ascari A410, an excellent road-going super sports car, you could even say supercar, from the similar kind of mindset that brought us cars like the Noble. Again, excellent sports car. This one, though, is another super underappreciated Ascari, which a lot of people don't even know exists, because this is an Ascari Le Mans prototype, or more specifically and technically, an LMP 900, and it's called the A410, as of course you saw from the title. Now, as I alluded to at the start of the video, this isn't an overly successful car. It did actually have a victory, but only one, and it suffered from a huge amount of mishaps, especially mechanical ones, a couple of crashes in there too for flavour, so it's not a successful car, not by any means, but it's an interesting one nonetheless, and it's kind of cool, I think, that Ascari even had this kind of race car, because when you think of Ascari, you think more stuff like the KZ1 GT3 or the Ascari A10, these more GT style machines, not something like a prototype. Now, the A410, which incidentally was renamed later on, which we'll discuss in a second, was built in the year 2000 under LMP 900 regulations, just like vehicles such as the BMW V12 LMR, and of course plenty of others too. Now, the car's chassis is actually a Lola. It's a Lola customer spec chassis so that a team could buy it, build up their own car, and take it racing. But here's the interesting thing. This car is an LMP 900, an open-top one, as you can see. But the funny thing is, the chassis and the suspension are actually from the Group C era, the Lola T92-10 model, which was a closed-top car as well. So a very interesting way to repurpose that chassis and that suspension, rework it into an LMP 900 machine instead. And that wouldn't necessarily be as easy to do today as it was for then. Now, the engine is going to be familiar to any fan of the Gran Turismo franchise because it's built by Judd, who of course have provided engines for a number of different prototypes, including, of course, Pasquarolo with the C60 Team PlayStation, which is a very popular car, debuted in Gran Turismo 4. We've had other ones since, but that was kind of the big dog at the time. That had a Judd V10, and so does this car, a 4-litre Judd GV4 engine. It's naturally aspirated, you're looking at 600 horsepower, which again is similar to other cars of the time. Red lines are over 10,000 RPM. Peak torque, which is incidentally over 330 pound-feet, also arrives at over 8,500 RPM, so the engine really does love to be worked hard, and it's not too surprising that it's that much of a screamer, because in its earlier forms the GV series was also used as an F1 engine, so essentially it's kind of like a spiritual successor in some ways, along with any other car that uses this engine, to stuff like the early 90s F1 tech that was used heavily in the Le Mans in cars like the Peugeot 905. And in the case of that car, to great success. It was such a good car, it won twice, in 92 and 93. For this Ascari, on the other hand, well, not so much. The car debuted in the year 2000 at Silverstone for a 500-kilometre race, but it actually didn't race at all because of gearbox issues, and long story short, it went on to have a number of issues. 2 vehicles were actually built, chassis number 1 and number 2. They raced at the Nürburgring, they raced in the Sports Racing World Cup under FIA rules. And actually, later on in the season, they did manage to have some success. At Monza, they managed to finish second, which was 7 seconds behind the leading car, which was a Ferrari 333 SP. And then at Spa, they managed to finish fourth, which, that's not too bad. They didn't get a win yet, but they were doing a bit better. They even managed to blow an engine in one race as well, which of course wasn't as good, but these are the kind of issues that plagued the car. Later on, when it was racing in later years, it even crashed, exiting a race after 15 hours, and those unfortunate events would plague the car much more than victory would. And unfortunately, that's ultimately the legacy of the car in terms of success. Now, it was later renamed for 2002 to 2003 to, strangely enough, the KZR1, which of course will sound familiar to anyone who knows Ascari or the cars that they make, because that's a little bit too close to the KZ1R, which of course is their road-going version of the race car, the GT class machine based on their supercar, the KZ1. But this is the KZR1, not the KZ1R. Kind of strange, you could say, to feature such a similar name, but you do you. Ultimately, the car didn't have much success at all. It had one victory, a couple of close finishes, but ultimately it was a car that, as many cars do, got forgotten, basically, due to ultimately a lack of success. If the car, of course, had had more victories, then it might have been remembered for longer. However, ultimately, despite all of its setbacks, it did actually manage to finish the entire season in its initial A410 form in 4th place, as far as teams go, so even that wasn't too bad. It was more a case of a car that was plagued by numerous issues across the board with DNFs, DNSs, and plenty of mechanical issues as well. So ultimately it's a car which isn't going to blow anyone's mind, but I just think it's a nice one to take a look at. And interestingly, one of the later cars, the KZR1, when it was renamed, was actually refitted instead of the Judd V10 with a BMW engine, a 4-litre V8. Ultimately, all of the cars weighed 900 kilos, as is the regulations at the time, and it's a car which I happen to think looks pretty cool as well. So ultimately, as I said, it's not going to blow your mind, but the fact that Ascari had this kind of race car I think is kind of cool. A lot of people don't know that they did. And it's just nice to sometimes shed some light on a team or a car or a manufacturer that you might not have known actually tried this whole LMP malarkey. Some had more success than others, but to me, it's pretty cool that Ascari at least tried. But ultimately, that's it for this pick, and of course, if you want to check out other weird and wacky cars in this series, of which there are plenty, that's for sure, then you can click through at the end to see those. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.